I'm Paulina. I'm 33 years old, and it's one of those Tuesday mornings when the light glides across the walls of my home office so softly it feels like the world has decided to grant me a brief respite from its usual storms. I'm settled at my desk with a cup of strong tea and my laptop in front of me, expecting a simple workday, the usual typing of code and a couple of video calls, but deep down, I have a faint premonition, as if fate was about to knock on my window and ask if I'd like to let it in. I worked for many years as a developer at a major tech company, and frankly, I have money. Not the luxurious income my grandmother dreamed of, but enough to live comfortably and plan for the future without panic. Exactly 4 years ago, I decided to do something that seemed crazy back then. I bought a house with a mortgage, invested my energy and cautious pride in it, opened a small office in it, and made working from home not just a convenience, but a meaningful experience. The company supports remote work, and I can truly be where I feel warm. Lately, life has been even better than I could have imagined. About a year ago, I met a man named Bruno online. He lives in another state, but our conversations were so sincere and quiet that the distance gradually began to shrink to a few trips and countless messages. He comes to visit me, I go to visit him, and each time these meetings remind me that it's possible to allow myself to be truly happy. So much so that I increasingly think about selling my house and moving in with him, because after all, my profession isn't tied to an address, and why not follow my heart? I was just dialing the code when I heard the familiar sound of a new email. Usually, if I'm in the flow of work, I turn off notifications and don't react in any way. But something this time, a slight nagging anxiety or simple female curiosity, made me open my old email inbox, an address I rarely use, and when I saw the name in the From field, my blood ran cold, because it was my mother, and I hadn't had contact with my mother or my entire family for 5 years, and behind those years lay too many unspoken things. Let me go back a bit and explain our family picture to you. My parents are now in their early 60s, and they have remained my quiet shores since I became an adult, and I also have an older sister, Sarah. She is 36. She is married to Gaspar, a man of motionless, neat, and infinitely serious, and 5 years ago, there was no such icy gap between us. We gathered on Saturdays for dinner, and I looked forward to these evenings the same way you look forward to the smell of homemade baking, with a soft trepidation and the certainty that it would be warm. Back then, when I was still saving for my first house and living in a rented apartment, I diligently saved up, and I had accumulated over $120,000, and I was proud of this sum, like a trophy of my patience, because the plan was to make a large down payment so that the monthly payments wouldn't become a burden that would eat away at the joy of life. Every Saturday, I would come to my parents' house for dinner. We would laugh, talk about trivial things, and the world seemed kind enough to hold all our hopes in our hands. But one of those evenings, which I remember down to the last detail, everything turned upside down. I arrived at their house. Sarah and Gaspar were already sitting at the table, and there was an excited confidence in their voices. My mother turned to me with a wide, almost radiant smile and announced that Sarah was going to start her own business, that she had a plan, and that her parents were confident she would succeed. I smiled back, but a familiar unease flared inside me, remembering how Sarah's 2 previous startups had ended in debt and regret, and how my parents had invariably been the ones to bail me out. When Sarah beamed, opened a folder of papers, and said to me, "Paulina, I have a detailed business plan. I only need money for development." I heard the familiar mixture of hope and pleading in her voice, and unable to resist, I asked point blank, "Why are you looking at me like that?" In response, she sweetly and slightly abruptly reminded me out loud that I was saving for a house and had savings. At that moment, I almost burst out laughing at the absurdity, because investing the money I was saving for my dream in yet another venture would mean handing over the keys to my own future. "Sarah, you've tried twice already. Is that enough?" I said, trying not to be too confrontational, but my words came out firmly and then began a scene I knew from memory like an old, painful play. Sarah blushed, her eyes filled with tears. She jumped up from her seat and, unable to control her emotions, ran out of the room, followed by Gaspar, and before the sound of the door closing and footsteps in the hallway followed, I heard him loudly call me an idiot and run after her. And so I was left alone with Mom and Dad, hoping that maybe now they would come to their senses. But they immediately pounced on me, calling me cruel, selfish, and greedy, and I, standing in the familiar living room, felt as if the thread of trust that connected us was being cut once and for all. I was simply saying what I thought, that if Sarah started her own business again, she would only rack up more debt. But my mother didn't want to hear it, and as if protecting her child, stubbornly said, "Sarah is more talented than you, Paulina. You're just jealous of her." And my father, who had been silent longer than usual, suddenly issued an ultimatum that made everything go dark. "Give me $120,000 or we'll cut you out of the family." I looked at them, at the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, and calmly replied, "I won't give her my money," because the house I'd been working toward for years wasn't a number for me, but a pillar of support, and for that word they kicked me out, told me to leave and never come back. So the next day I changed my phone number, blocked all communication, and made sure none of them could find me. A year later, I bought a house, as planned, and lived without them for 5 years, accustoming myself to silence and voluntary solitude. I learned from rumors among mutual friends that Sarah was indeed doing well. She'd bought a house, traveled with Gaspar, and despite my early resentment, I sincerely rejoiced at her successes, but kept my distance. Imagine the feeling that awakened in me when, years later, I saw my mother's name in the old mailbox, and my hands trembled as I unfolded the piece of paper containing a short, anxious note. "Paulina, we need to see each other urgently. It's a matter of life and death. Please come home." And my first, almost panicked thought was that one of them was dying, because no matter how angry I wasn't heartless, and not knowing about real trouble would have been torture for me. So I replied curtly, "I'll come this Saturday." Saturday morning arrived in a flash. I barely slept, going over terrifying scenarios, and drove to my parents with a stabbing melancholy in my chest. When I pulled up, I noticed 2 new cars in the driveway, Sarah's Porsche and Gaspar's Mercedes, both as immaculate as their calm confidence, and I lingered in the car, composing myself before knocking on the door and entering. My mother opened it, her voice trembling, and for a second we simply looked at each other. She was older, with new wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, and in a whisper, barely audible, she said, "Paulina, thank you for coming." And everyone was already in the living room. My father in his chair, looking heavy, Sarah on the sofa next to Gaspar, her eyes puffy, and although they seemed happy to see me, anxiety was visible in every look. I didn't sit down, but asked directly, "What's going on?" The letter was about life and death, and Mom, unable to contain herself, burst into tears, explaining that it was about Sarah. She was in serious trouble. Her business had gone bankrupt 3 months ago. The bank had foreclosed on her house, and even without a roof over her head, she was still deeply in debt, and these debts were large and dangerous. Sarah, barely breathing, for some reason quietly uttered a figure that sent a chill through everyone in the room: $150,000. Gaspar added that they owed this money to private investors, people who didn't accept promises of, "I'll pay later," that they were receiving calls and threats, claiming to know where they lived and what their family's habits were. I felt sorry for them, and I said it out loud, but holding love and resentment in one bag, I still didn't understand why I was here and what you wanted from me. That's when Mom dropped the bomb, speaking as casually as if she were talking about buying a loaf of bread. "We know you bought a house. It's a good deal. But Paulina, we think you should sell it and help Sarah pay off her debts." I stared at her as if she'd grown a second head and just gasped, "Are you crazy?" Mom, as if she'd already prepared her answer, continued in a soft but compelling voice. "You're still young. You can earn enough to buy another house, but Sarah and Gaspar could suffer greatly if they don't pay back this money." I glanced around the room and felt something between anger and weariness rise within me. I took a deep breath and said, "Let me get this straight. 5 years ago, you kicked me out of the family because I refused to give Sarah money for her business. Now that business has failed, she's in debt to dangerous people, and you want me to sell my house to save her?" My father cleared his throat and said, "Family helps family." And the word family sounded so false on his lips that I couldn't help but laugh. But it was an empty laugh, without joy, and I reminded him, "You told me yourself that I'm not part of the family anymore. Have you forgotten?" Sarah burst into even louder sobs. "I know we were wrong, but things are different now. Those people won't just sue us, they will harm us." And I, looking at her white face, said coldly, "Then maybe you should have thought about that before taking money from loan sharks." Gaspar jumped up, his voice shaking with anger. "You have no idea how much pressure we're under." I shrugged. "You're right, I can't imagine, but I clearly saw 2 expensive cars in the driveway. Maybe you could start by selling them and paying off some of the debt?" Sarah exhaled sharply and almost shouted, "We need these cars for work." I shook my head. "You need them far less than protection from people who could ruin your life." Mom stood up and came closer, looking me straight in the eye. "If you sold that house you so proudly bought, you could pay off Sarah's debt and still have money left over for a nice apartment." "A nice apartment?" I repeated, feeling my insides boiling. "Mom, I worked hard for this house for years, saved every penny, scrimped on everything, and now you want me to destroy it all to right Sarah's wrongs?" Dad, who had been silent until then, interjected, "She's your sister." I turned to him abruptly. "And she's a grown woman who made her own choice." "A bad one, apparently." Sarah jumped up from the couch, her voice filled with despair. "You have to help." "You should care what happens to me," I asked coldly. "Where was your family loyalty 5 years ago when you all told me to get out and forget about you?" Mom muttered, "It was different then." "In what way?" I raised my eyebrows. "I refused to help financially back then, and now I refuse to help financially again. The only difference is that now I don't want to lose my house." For a moment, there was a deathly silence. Everyone looked at me as if I was the one destroying their world. I took a deep breath and said, "I won't do this. Sarah got herself into this mess. Let her get out of it herself. If you want to help her so much, sell your house and give her the money." My mother gasped, as if I'd struck her, and whispered, "This is our only home, Paulina. We're old. We can't start over like you." I looked at them and calmly replied, "Then you understand why I can't sell my house either." I turned and headed for the door. From behind me, I heard Sarah shout, "You're making a huge mistake. These people don't waste their time." I turned and looked her in the eye. "I don't waste my time either." And I walked out. The walk home seemed endless, but as soon as I stepped over the threshold of my house, I felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulder. The first thing I did was block my mom's email address and decide I wouldn't let their drama ruin my life anymore. A week passed surprisingly calmly. No emails, no calls, just silence. I even began to think they finally realized I wasn't their ATM. All this time, Bruno called me every day, and I told him everything that had happened, and he just kept repeating, "You did the right thing." They can't disappear from your life for 5 years and come back just so you can solve their problems. And I agreed, feeling a strange relief. Yes, I was sorry that Sarah was in trouble, but it wasn't my fault or my responsibility. I had my own life. But on Tuesday morning, as I stood in the kitchen, making coffee and inhaling the aroma of freshly ground beans, I heard a car door slam in the yard. I looked out the window and almost dropped my mug. Mom and Dad were walking down my driveway. My heart pounded so hard in my chest that it became difficult to breathe. How the hell did they find my address? Flashed through my mind. I threw the door open before they even knocked and asked angrily, "What are you doing here? How did you know where I live?" Mom looked up and said with a strange pride, "Sarah hired a private investigator. We needed to talk to you in person since you blocked my email." A private detective. I almost laughed, but the laughter caught in my throat, and the words came out dry and sharp. "Are you serious?" Dad, meanwhile, was turning his head from side to side, his gaze greedily sliding over every detail of my yard, the walls, the garden, and I clearly saw the gears turning in his head, calculations, estimates, as if he was already measuring the value of my house against some internal spreadsheet. "Nice place," he said almost approvingly, as if he were talking about buying a new cow at the fair. "Get off my property," I snapped. But Mom suddenly pushed me aside as if I were a door blocking her way, and entered the house as if it belonged to her. Dad followed her without a hint of hesitation. I stood in complete shock, frozen for a second, not believing their impudence. "Don't get comfortable," I hissed through my teeth. "You're not staying here." Mom was already wandering around the living room, her fingers sliding along the shelves, examining my books, my photographs, my little things, as if trying them on in her own life. "If you sold this house," she said with a cold, calculating air, "you could easily pay off Sarah's debt, and you'd still have money left over for a smaller house, or at least a nicer apartment." I took a deep breath and reminded her, "I already told you, I'm not selling my house." "But look at all this space," Dad interjected, spreading his arms as if to embrace the walls. "You're the only one living here. Why do you need so much space?" "What I need is none of your business," I retorted. Mom suddenly turned around, her eyes glistening with tears. "Sarah is terrified, Paulina. Those people called her yesterday. They know where she and Gaspar are staying. They said that if they don't get the money by the end of the month, something bad will happen." "Then maybe Sarah should call the police," I snapped. "The police won't help," Dad muttered. "These aren't the kind of people you can stop with a court paper." I felt my insides boiling, and the fatigue was washing over me with renewed vigor. "But that's not my problem," I said clearly. "You have to leave, now." "We're not leaving until you agree to help your sister," Mom said, crossing her arms over her chest and seemingly rooted to the spot. "Then I'll call the police," I replied, taking out my phone and dialing. Dad grabbed my arm abruptly. "Don't be silly." "Let me go," I barked, shaking his hand off like a snake. "I'll call them right now if you don't leave immediately." They saw I wasn't joking, and that stopped them. Mom's sob grew louder, her shoulders shaking. "Okay, Paulina, but this isn't over. If anything happens to Sarah, it's on you." I looked her coldly in the eyes. "And if anything happens to my life because I throw away my financial security to right someone else's wrongs, it's on me, too. At least it's fairer this way. Everyone bears their own consequences." Dad raised a finger at me, his voice heavy and threatening. "You'll regret it. Family needs to stay together." "You didn't think about that 5 years ago," I replied, and a silence fell between us, heavy and poisonous. They finally left, but before they left, Dad threw a vague threat in my face, saying I'd have to face the consequences for abandoning my family. I locked the door, leaned my back against it, and felt my hands tremble. A few minutes later, I was already calling the realtor with whom I'd recently discussed selling the house and moving in with Bruno. "Hi, it's Paulina. Remember how we talked about listing the house? I need to sell it as quickly as possible. I'm willing to take a 5% discount if it will speed things up." The realtor paused for a second, then said, "Well, you picked an interesting time. I have a buyer looking at your neighborhood. With that kind of discount, he'll probably be interested. Let me make a few calls." 3 days later, he called back. The offer was lower than I expected, but given the speed of the transaction and my concession, it seemed fair. I agreed immediately, without hesitation. When I told Bruno about this, he frowned. "Why the rush?" he asked. I explained everything, how my parents had come, how they had behaved, that I didn't trust them and that I was afraid they would continue to stalk me, perhaps even do something crazy. "It's better to sell the house and hide the money in a safe place so they'll never see it," I finished. "I guess that makes sense," he nodded, And by the way, that means you can move in with me sooner than we planned. I smiled for the first time in days. Do you mind if I stay with you while I look for a new house in your area? He laughed. Are you kidding? I was hoping you'd move in with me permanently. It'll just speed things up. The deal went through surprisingly quickly. Within a week, all the paperwork was completed, and the house was officially no longer mine. Bruno came to help me pack, and his presence was a huge relief. I wasn't left alone with my fear and fatigue. We packed boxes together, loaded them into the truck, and when the last crate was in the back, I turned around once more and looked at my house. It stood as beautiful and reliable as I'd loved it all these years. It was my fortress, my refuge, my proof that I could do it myself, without anyone else's help. I remembered the first time I crossed its threshold, how I'd rejoiced in every little detail, how proud I was of every wall. I was happy there. I worked tirelessly for him, and yet I felt no regret. I knew I was doing the right thing, and though my heart sank, I was glad I had decided to sell. Bruno and I were starting a new chapter, and my family could no longer use my house as leverage. So when he hugged me that night and quietly asked, "Are you okay?" I answered, trying not to betray the trepidation in my voice, "Yes, I'm fine," and taking his hand, whispered, "Let's get out of here." We got into the car and drove away, and in that moment I felt a huge weight lift from my shoulders, because what had been a cage of obligations and reproaches for me for years was finally no longer my burden. We settled in together, and life with Bruno turned out to be surprisingly warm. His home was cozy, and my remote work quickly settled into new rituals. In the evenings, we'd stare at our tablets, browsing houses online and dreaming of choosing a small street, flowers by the windows, and a bench by the door. For the first time in months, I felt free from daily anxiety, because now what was happening with Sarah and her debts couldn't affect either my money or my peace of mind. About a month later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the phone on the windowsill vibrated, and an unfamiliar number with the area code for my old city displayed a name I'd known since childhood. The voice on the line introduced itself with restraint and formality. "This is Officer Colombo calling regarding an incident involving your parents, Vincenzo and Alessia Russo." In that phrase, I heard not only a name, but also a cold harbinger of trouble. I clutched my cup and asked, incredulously, "What incident?" "They were arrested last night for breaking and entering," he replied. And then, as if a movie had been sped up, he began listing the details. The address, 847 Maple Street, the very one I'd sold a month ago. The new owner came home and found your parents in the living room, where, according to an eyewitness, they were smashing furniture with a baseball bat, breaking windows, and leaving a trail of destruction, with damage estimated at approximately $40,000. I almost fell over, thinking about how all this family hysteria could have escalated into tragedy. Imagine if the owner had been armed, if one of the parents had taken a bullet instead of smashing someone else's table. The officer listened to my short, hoarse confession. Yes, my parents had stalked me, demanded I sell the house, threatened me, and shown up uninvited, and he politely wrote it all down, but explained that, legally, my previous ownership changed little. "They probably thought they were getting revenge on you, but they were actually damaging someone else's property," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. In the weeks that followed, the news washed over me like waves. The charges were serious, but their lawyer had negotiated a plea deal in exchange for no jail time, and the punishment was financial: restitution, legal fees, and expenses, totaling nearly $60,000. My friend Jenny called and, with undisguised surprise and sadness, told me the most heartbreaking news. My parents had been forced to sell their only home, the very one they'd until recently called their rock, because they had no other choice. After they'd settled the accounts, they'd given the remaining money to Sarah to pay off her debts and try to save her from the very investors who'd brought it all on her. I sat on Bruno's couch and couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. In the end, they'd done exactly what they wanted, but with their own home instead of mine. That wasn't even the best part. It turned out that Sarah's problems with creditors, which she'd been threatening us with, had nothing to do with the grim tales of broken kneecaps and mysterious threats in dark alleys. On the contrary, this whole danger turned out to be far more prosaic. A legitimate investment firm had threatened to sue her for non-payment, and all that really awaited her were lawsuits and hearings, not men in leather jackets waiting at the door. I sat for a long time with the phone in my hand, unable to believe that everything I'd experienced, the whispers, the calls, my parents' tears, their frantic demands, and ultimately, what they'd done in someone else's house, was built on her lies, on her ability to make mountains out of molehills to panic my parents and force them to pressure me. The truth hit me like a bolt from the blue, and I realized that Sarah had been manipulating everyone, including Mom and Dad, so skillfully that they were convinced her life was hanging by a thread. I asked Jenny, "Where do Mom and Dad live now?" and was told that they were sharing a small 2-bedroom apartment with Sarah and Gaspar. The 4 of them were crammed in there, arguing almost every day. Although I felt genuinely sorry for them, I knew they weren't in such a bad situation yet that they could approach me directly. A few months passed, and I learned that the family was trying to contact me through mutual friends, wanting to apologize, explain themselves, and repair our relationship. But every time someone cautiously raised the topic, I firmly answered no. Jenny called again, her voice soft but insistent. "Your mother asked me to tell you she's sorry, that they realize they did wrong." And I answered, feeling a bitter weariness welling up inside me. It's too late to apologize. For 5 years, they didn't care whether I lived or died. Then they demanded I go broke because of Sarah's mistakes. Then they resorted to crime themselves when I wouldn't dance to their tune. I've had enough. I spoke firmly. Family isn't someone who abandons you for years and shows up only to demand money. Family doesn't hire private investigators to follow you. Family doesn't break into people's houses with baseball bats, masquerading it all as love. Bruno listened, sitting next to me, and when I hung up, he simply took my hand and quietly asked, "Are you okay?" I smiled at him through my fatigue and said, "I'm actually perfect. We found a house we both love, I'm doing great at work, and I don't have to deal with their drama anymore." He smiled back and, looking at me with a particularly serious expression, added, "Speaking of a house we love, I was thinking about something more than just a proposal." And right there in our living room, dropping to one knee, he pulled out a small ring box and said words that took my breath away. "Paulina, will you marry me? We can buy this house together and start a real life." For the first time in months, I burst into tears of happiness, hugged him, and whispered, "Yes, of course. Yes." We got engaged that day, and by the weekend we had proposed on the house, and when it was accepted, we began planning our wedding for next year. Sometimes I still think about my family and wonder if I made the right choice by completely cutting them off. But then I remember how calm and smooth my life has become without their constant drama, threats, and manipulation. And I realize, yes, it was. Sarah created her own problems by making reckless deals. Mom and Dad chose to indulge her instead of letting her face the consequences. And in the end, they all chose to make me a target rather than take responsibility. I chose something different. I chose to live with someone who loves and supports me. I chose financial security and peace of mind. I chose to surround myself with people who don't demand, threaten, or play on my emotions. I think I made the best choice, because now Bruno and I are making wedding plans. Even thinking about having children, my career is taking off. I recently got a promotion, and I'm happy. Truly, genuinely happy. And I know, none of this would have been possible if I had allowed my family to drag me back into their endless mess. So no, I don't regret cutting them off for a second.